Wow, that was pretty good. One shush and that happened. Excellent. Well, thanks, everybody. I think folks probably know I'm Abby Selnicker. I'm the past chair of MassBio and a partner at Third Rock Ventures. And I am very fortunate to have the opportunity to participate in a fireside chat with Terry McGuire and Bob Langer, who are the dynamic duo of biotech. I was tempted to make a football analogy on this, and I started my biotech career in San Francisco, so I was going to go with the Montana Rice analogy, but I'll go with the Brady Edelman analogy. But why don't we start, really, we're going to talk a little bit about lessons learned in founding and creating biotech companies and watching them evolve and mature. And would love to hear the perspectives that Terry and Bob have on doing this. But I think it would be great if we guys could just introduce how you got started. Not necessarily who you are, because I think everybody knows who you are. But how did you get started in the industry? How did you sort of make a move into being entrepreneurs and company creators? Jerry?
Sure. So I was, in fact, I graduated from business school and was looking to get into venture capital, and this was back in the late 80s. And at that time, we all had to be generalists, and so I actually joined a firm in Chicago called Golder, Tolman, Cressy, Rauner, famous now because the governor of Illinois is Bruce Rauner, one of the partners there. But I realized that what I really loved was early stage investing, and so I came back to Boston and joined a firm called Barrigue and Deliage, which had both tech and life science investing. And so while I'm not trained as I think anyone who knows me knows that my last biology class was in high school. You know, I really have been able to focus on biotechnology really by learning from people like Bob and surrounding myself with people like Bob. And so, you know, in fact, as we were coming over today, I was trying to remember how we met, because it's been over 25 years since we've been partnering together. And so that's essentially what drew me into the business. And as Jeff was saying in his comments, Bob was saying in his comments, you know, the chance to change people's lives is really a compelling proposition, even for venture capitalists, which is expected to generate strong returns. And so the idea of coming into this industry, working with great people like Bob, was really exciting for me and got me excited to be in the business.
Yeah, well, for me, it was more about probably having a desire to do something good and at the same time making a lot of mistakes. And so when I'm a chemical engineer, and when I got done, all my friends went into the oil industry pretty much. And I wasn't very excited about doing that, and I ended up going to Boston Children's Hospital and working for a surgeon named Judah Folkman in 1974. And I was actually the only engineer in the hospital, and my job was, he had this idea, if you could stop blood vessels, that might be a new way of thinking about treating cancer and other diseases. And so my job was to see if I could actually isolate the first substances that would stop blood vessels from growing and develop techniques to study them. And people were super skeptical about that at the time. Since I knew nothing about biology, I didn't know that. But I thought it was a great idea, and we did. We published in Science in 1976 the first paper showing you could actually do this in isolating substances. And of course, 28 years later, that would lead to drugs like Avastin and many others at Eylea that are now, you know, widely used. But at any rate, I was just doing this research, and then I also, at the same time, to do that, got involved in creating little plastics that could deliver drugs for a long time, because these molecules that would stop blood vessels from growing were big, and we needed to have a way to deliver them for a long time, and that hadn't been done, and actually people didn't think you could do it. So anyhow, I did that, and we published that one in Nature, and I thought this was great. You know, I'm publishing these papers, and companies will start using them. But nobody did. You know, they'd use them in academics, but like about 10 years would go by and nobody would use them, other than for writing scientific papers. And then we wrote some patents, and about 10 years after I started, I got a couple calls from really giant companies, IMC, who wanted to use it in animal health, like for animal growth hormones, and Eli Lilly, who wanted to use it for insulin. And I thought, so excited, they were going to license it, they're going to give me a consulting fee and a big grant. You know, if you're a professor, that means a lot to have the grant. And I thought this was great, and I got the better car out of it and everything, but unfortunately, they did a couple of experiments, they didn't work, and they kind of gave up. And so a couple of years later, Alex Klebanoff, who's a friend of mine, said, Bob, we should start our own company to try to develop these. And that would lead to Enzotech, which merged to become Alkermes, and they developed all these microspheres for delivering different drugs for super long times. So really, I ended up getting involved in it because of really, to me, the small companies, unlike the large companies, really people would walk through walls. In fact, most of the time it was my own students who would work at these companies. The first 4 employees of Enzotech were actually my students. And to me, that was just such an exciting thing to think that you could use science to make products that could, really transform people's lives.
That's exciting, and it's interesting that you brought up this concept of that the smaller companies seem to have a sense of urgency and a sense of determination that's a little bit different than maybe the larger companies, where there's multiple things that they can be working on, and so if something doesn't work, they can sometimes just move along to the next one. I think we've all seen that, and sometimes you see these things that people thought will never work, and then all of a sudden somebody finds the secret to make it work by focusing on it. I know personally for myself as an entrepreneur and someone who's started several companies, that the relationship between the founders and investors it's a delicate one, but it's a really special one. And I think you guys have formed at least 25 or more companies together. So you've got a really well-established relationship. You've got some sort of foundation in how you work together and how you think about things. Could you talk a little bit about that? So, a little bit more on how you originally started working together, and then what it was about sort of the combination of, how you thought about things, Terry, from a business perspective, and Bob, how you were bringing the science and technology, and then how those lines got blurred.
Yeah, it's funny. I've often said we could talk about business concepts and alignment of interests, but at the beginning of any strong partnerships, there has to be trust. And so I think what was fundamental when I first got to know Bob and looked at his lab and looked at all the things he was doing, that he was going to change the world. But this was also a person that I could enter into a relationship and have a trusting relationship with. And I think too often entrepreneurs and venture capitalists are sort of held out as being people on different sides of the aisle, and in fact they're not at all, and they should be completely aligned. And so I think some of the lessons that I learned as a child from my parents, which is work with people that you trust, people that you respect, people that have an alignment of interests, and that's what I found with Bob Langer. And so what's been great about the relationship is through the last 25 companies in 25 years, there have been many great days, but there have been tough days. And you really learn about a partner during the tough days. And so I think working with Bob, knowing that he's a true partner, has made all the difference in the world. And by the way, I've described Bob as my favorite venture capitalist because his currency is different than mine. He deals in technology and people, and that's what you need to build great companies. And so when Bob calls us sort of say, here's another company, it's based on this knowledge that he knows what is great science, what are great people, what are marketable ideas. And then fundamentally we come back to this human thing, which is here's a person that I trust that I've been through good times and bad times with through the years, and we've built some amazing companies.
Yeah, well, for me, actually, I'd say a couple of things. One, I'll use your football analogy. One of the things that Terry said, Terry always comes up with these great sayings, but this one, he said, he sees himself as a coach, so he's actually more like Bill Belichick. Okay. and really, and he's been a fantastic coach. And I mean, he's probably a lot warmer guy than Bill Belichick, but at any rate.
I hope so.
But at any rate, he's been a wonderful coach, and I think that's been one element. The other thing I'd say, it's interesting. A number of years ago, Harvard had this biotechnology club, and actually the guy who started it is now the head of RA Capital, and he had these interviews, and actually both of us did them. They're actually really detailed interviews, and I remember one of the things that I read when I looked at Terry's interview, which I thought was quite a bit better than mine, is that they were asking him, about venture capital, and Terry said, well, in venture capital, he said, there's something called the golden rule. And the guy says, well, Peter Kolchinsky says, well, what's that? Terry said, well, that means that gold rules. And he said, he doesn't believe in that that's not his policy. His policy really is to do good, as he said, to help patients. And by doing so, and actually also to work with the founders and the employees to create a good experience, with the idea that actually what they'll do is, if there's a good experience, is they'll keep coming back and back to him with good ideas. And so, when I've seen Terry give his talks, he has these trees of people, not just me, but lots of others that keep coming back to work with him and Polaris over and over again because they have had, you know, such a good experience. And I think that that was a good example of what he's done, you know, in terms of making other things rule other than just gold.
So when you think about Terry, you used the word trust and you used the word coaching, Bob, and you think about the kind of relationship when you're innovating, right? We take a ton of risk. I mean, that's what we all do, right? And with risk, there, you know, it comes, you know, disagreement, obviously. People are trying to find ways to mitigate risk. They're trying to find ways to, you know, sort of break the mold. What is it that allows the natural tension that is necessary in order to really make the great decisions? What is it that allows that? Because not everybody can disagree with each other and have a constructive disagreement as opposed to have a really productive disagreement.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is trust. I also think part of it, again, is recognizing your own limitations. Like, and see, for me, I mean, I think I'm a decent scientist, but I've never thought I was a great business person. And I don't trust myself, really. I mean, people ask me to, like, interview CEOs and stuff like that. I always think, like, you know, anybody, a lot of CEOs, good people could pull the wool over my eyes. I'm not that good a judge of that type of thing. But I feel like I can help on, you know, sort of the scientific things in terms of the scientific people. But I feel like, say, when I work with Terry, Terry is a good judge of business people, and he's a good judge of business things. And I think that's a partnership, you know, that, and so I personally feel like, you know, I don't feel confident enough that I can pick, you know, great business people, but I feel lucky that I can sort of trust him to do so. And hopefully he feels that I can help get some good scientists.
And I was going to say the exact same thing as Bob said, but I'll repeat it in some ways, which is, by the way, he's a better judge of character than he lets on. He's seen a lot of really strong CEOs and others that have not been successful, and so he's a good judge of that. But I think there's this complementarity that we've sort of perfected, because when it comes to science, Bob clearly is a world-renowned scientist and has a great ability to judge science, and I think I have a reasonably good ability to judge business models and business people. And so when we work together in that sense, having said that, when Bob walks in and says, geez, I don't understand why this candidate is a viable candidate, I don't sort of say, well, you don't know that area. I know it better than you do. It really resonates with me, and I think if I ask a probing question on science, Bob will sort of step back and say, well, boy, that's a good question. Let's get an answer to it. So we do challenge each other, but it's this very complementary relationship which has been the core of what we've created.
And do you think that relationship, again, going back to the word trust, you said it a couple times, is it time that allows that trust to develop? Is it experience being in the trenches with somebody? How does that happen?
Yeah, I think there's moments, I think this trust relationship was established 25 years ago. And there are moments in every relationship, whether they be in business or in your personal lives, where you look at someone and sort of see how they behave. And so I'm sure there was a moment way back when in one of the first couple companies where Bob could have had the upper hand and he could have taken advantage of me at the moment, and he didn't. And I hope there's a story that he has in the back of his mind, which is there was a similar moment when the gold should have ruled, but the gold didn't rule. And I think in that sense, you can create these moments of, boy, you know, the typical entrepreneur would have behaved this way, but Bob behaved a slightly different way, and then vice versa. And for me, that was the most important thing.
Yeah. Well, speaking as an academic, you know, I actually don't think academics, when they work with venture capitalists, have the upper hand, ever. I mean, almost ever. Maybe it's rare. I just feel like, you know, when I started, and that's actually part of what I appreciated about working with Terry, you know, that I could see the first couple times I got involved in starting companies, and I was working with some people, this was the 80s, you know, some pretty famous people in the venture capital area, but I could keep seeing how they would, in some cases, try to take advantage or make me, you know, like I didn't want, for example, just to take one thing out of our lab and see it help people. I wanted to see a lot of the things that we did help people, and they kind of would make you feel, well, all of it should go into, you know, their company or their fund, and I felt like, well, that was compromising doing good for people in other ways. So I felt that really when I looked at it, that people would, that they did have the upper hand, and they would not always treat, not just me, but my students, other academics, sometimes not as well as I thought we should be treated. And you know, I think were just incredibly straightforward about everything, and you know, never did any of that. There was never like any manipulation or anything like that.
just to add to something that you just said, Bob, as far as the academics and do they ever have the upper hand? And I would say sometimes they actually do, because the technology is so important, right? The person who's developed it, the relationship that they have built with the technology and with the other people who might know how to use it the best, and bringing founders together, bringing the academic scientists together in just the right way creates that sort of secret sauce and that magic. And one founder can say, no, not going to work with you, and you're out of luck, right? Because sometimes the technology is that rare. So rather than thinking about it as that upper hand, it's more both people come in with something that the other one needs,
Sure.
right? And
Oh, I agree.
how do we make that happen? But just to, sort of the gold rules or the cash is king or however, we say it, I just would sort of ask a question about human capital and financial capital, right? They're both key to what we do. We talk a lot at MassBio about the workforce management and where's all the talent going to come from, and the key to having the right people in the right companies, having enough capital to make things work. That old saying that if you've got a B product and an A team or an A product and a B team, take the A team. Just curious how you guys think a group of people, teamwork and that integration of the first people in the company can really make or break the success of a company.
Yeah, so as a venture capitalist, I probably should be saying that financial capital is the most important, but it's not. It's all about the teams. It's all about recruiting the right talent. And by the way, the right talent for day 1 to day 300 or 900 may be a different set of talent than from 900 thereafter. And so just recognizing that the most important ingredient to starting these companies, is in the people. It's found in the people, and it's often found in the leadership itself. So I think the first few critical hires are so important for a company. They set a tone. They set a way in which the company's going to build itself. And so when I look at starting companies, and I know I've had this conversation repeatedly with Bob, which is it's not just good enough to have good science and good financial resources, but it really is who is the team, who's going to take this thing forward, how are they going to do that, and making sure it's right and making sure it's prepared to grow.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, again, I mean, if you start out wrong and pick the wrong people, I mean, you get behind. It's like being out 28-3, down 28-3. You might come back, but that's not an easy thing to do. And so I think you'd much rather be ahead by that much. So I think that's just absolutely right. You really, when you start making mistakes early on, it's very hard to catch up.
So I'm just going to see whether anybody in the audience has any questions about any of the things that we've been discussing so far. We want to make sure that this is as interactive as possible, but any questions, comments? We'll have plenty of chances, yeah?
I'd love to hear a description of one of the good ideas that failed and how you guys now negotiated your relationship through that failure.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's important to consider is, I don't think anything's really a failure per se. It's lessons learned and opportunities. And maybe the question is, how do you really think through things to avoid those things? And what are the kind of chemistry that you can have, and what can you look at to sort of problem solve and not find yourself in a rut of a failure?
Well, one of the things that's striking about Bob and his work is that most of the technologies are platform technologies, that there are multiple shots on goal. And so I'm sure there are situations where the first shot on goal wasn't quite the shot we needed to take, but then we moved on to a second shot on goal. So I think it's this breadth of, and also this willingness to work the problem, not simply throw up your hands and say it doesn't work. It's really to move on. And again, because of the power of the platform ideas, we're allowed to do that. We're allowed to sort of say, is this first one really, is it the killer app that we want, or should we be looking for a second killer app? And if so, then the question is, how quickly can we get onto that second killer app? But again, given there's an alignment of interest, it's not like there's a scientist saying you got to do it this way, you got to do it that way, or venture capitalists saying the same thing, which is a partnership in finding the next application.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think Abby's point, I really agree with what you said, and I'm not trying to be negative on the question, but I felt like, so many times people, and when I look at our work or anybody's work, I'm saying this maybe as a scientist more than from business, but I think like failure, like we just heard about immunotherapy. I mean, for years that was a failure. Angiogenesis, I mean, I've heard people call out a failure and a success. I mean, I think there's so many of these things. And with companies even, like I still remember with Alza one time, Martin Gerstel, who was once the CEO, was giving this talk, and he was showing the stock going up and down, you know, and people thinking it was either a failure or success depending on the day. But I mean, to me, it's this continuum. I mean, the way I kind of look at all of the area of biotechnology is it's had lots of ups and downs over the last 40 years, but it's been pretty amazing, you know, how far we've come collectively, you know, with all the products and all the people being helped. And I think so many of these things are like what Terry just said, you know, platform technologies. You know, and a lot of times we make mistakes, we don't figure out the right thing to use in that platform, maybe even the first or second time. But eventually, or you don't figure out the right way to use the drug the right way the first or second time. But again, if you keep believing in it and you keep trying, and again, I think it more of a scientist than as a business person, you know, if you keep at it, eventually you'll find probably a lot of applications for these things, and they'll do a lot of good.
No, I think it's right. I think, you know, one of the things that you find is that the investment community and the academic founders are very resilient to the ups and downs. And it's part of what we do. We know about it. We're ready for it. And I think that resilience is what allows everybody to continue to take the risk. So it's more about, you know, where are you on the journey as opposed to the destination necessarily.
Yeah, I also think, just to add to what you said, I mean, part of the issue too when you try to do these things is about money. You know, like, I mean, one of the great difficulties and hardships of for all the positive things about biotech and medicine, it's like to take one thing from a discovery to a drug or a device is just so unbelievably expensive. So if you pick the wrong one, even if the technology is good, let's say you have the platform technology, you could spend $1 billion, and it doesn't mean it's a bad technology or a failure. It just means, you know, we weren't probably smart enough or didn't design the right clinical trial or didn't pick the right target. But, you know, that doesn't mean with the next $1 billion you couldn't, you know, get, you know, find one that would work right or find a way to get the drug to work right. So again, if you're able to raise enough money, then you can have shots on goal with these platforms, and the chances of you ultimately getting a success happens. I mean, just to pick an example of a company I've been involved in fact, Polaris was started as, you take Alnylam. I mean, Alnylam, which I think is a great example of it. I mean, John, I think, did a tremendous, you know, at first I think the technology is great, siRNA, but, you know, and I've been involved in that since the beginning, but if you watch it, you know, what was it, about 3 years ago, their number 3 drug, they had a number of drugs in clinical trials. There was a death, they had to cancel the clinical trial. I think about a year ago, their number 2 drug, you know, there was a death, and it was in pretty advanced clinical trials, and they had to stop that. But their number 1 drug, you know, had fantastic results. They didn't find that out till after the other 2, you know, had the problem. But because they had done good science and because they had enough money to weather the storm, well, that to me looks like historic. And Alnylam's trading at 150 today, you know, with 0 sales, but because now people really understand that the technology will work and will change the world. But thank God that John raised enough money. If he didn't have that money and didn't do all that, people could say it's a failure because he did. And you have those shots on goal. Now it's an unbelievable success.
Any other questions or comments? Terry, maybe I'd ask you, you know, sort of on the financial theme for a moment, you know, this concept of what's enough money and how do you judge that, and what role does sort of a person's prior reputation have in, you know, deciding the comfort on investing? Just curious.
So the question is, how much capital is required, or?
Well, or how do you decide that, really?
Yeah.
You know, on a given technology, when you look at something, is it risk-based? Are you sort of saying, let's get to a proof of concept and then
Yeah,
put
there's
some more?
a couple things. And in fact, I was reflecting on this question you asked us, what's changed, or how, talk about this relationship. And lots changed in the last 25 years. One of those changes is the amount of capital that's been required, or at least raised. And so, you know, I hate dilution. From a venture capital perspective, I hate when my founders get diluted. So we
That's
try
good.
to. Well, it is good because it maintains alignment of interest, and so I actually think it's the right thing to do. I think if I look at our best successes, it's where the founding team has had the most of the company at the end of the day, and so I think we're just very cautious and careful about how we deploy capital. But because these are based on these long-term relationships, we know there's capital there. We just want to deploy the right amount at the right time. And so, I mean, I don't know whether a $100 million first round is the new norm or not. And I'm still trying to get used to that concept. I may be showing my gray beard in me, but you know, the world has really changed a lot. And I think, having said that, as Bob points out, for these companies, they need to raise a lot of capital to grow themselves. And so it's a delicate dance. And something, you know, I've often argued that venture capital, by its nature, is on a frontier. It needs to be on a frontier, otherwise there's not enough change for opportunity. And I think one of the frontier moments is how much capital is raised right now. And the only thing I would say is I don't mind raising a lot of capital, but I really don't want to see the founders get diluted by raising too much capital all at once.
Yeah, so there's two, for me, there's two follow-up questions there. One is about the dilution. Let's get back to that in a minute. But Bob, maybe you could comment as a founder, when you sort of have an idea, do you go in thinking this is how much it's going to take to get there? Or do you go in and say, this is amazing, and how much will you give me to get there?
Yeah, well, I definitely try to do the amazing part.
Yeah.
And that's what I believe. You know, that's a great question. I think what you try to figure out is there some milestone that you could hit that will up the value significantly or lower the risk significantly? And that's a tough thing to figure out sometimes, you know. But I mean, so I probably do some of each, but you know, and a lot of it also depends to me on what whoever else I'm working with wants to see. You know, a lot of times it's been with my students or maybe some other professors or some people, you know, who want to work full time, and different people have different appetites for risk and reward, and I want to do what they want to do. But I guess what I usually think about is what I said, is there something, you want some money, but is there something that could be done that will allow you to really de-risk this thing significantly, that you could, you know, get a proof of principle that will change things, or maybe, you know, or if you feel your technology's far enough along, maybe you could get a great deal that will, you know, reduce risk significantly. So I probably do some of each, and then you also want to see what the people who are, you know, in the company want to do, what the people who are financing the company want to do, and so it's kind of a team effort also.
And Terry, you get a sense of a negotiation with that, in your experiences with Bob. Have you guys found yourself, you know, just negotiating to find the right starting point on funding?
You know, I think typically it's fun. We would do deals, you know, through voicemails. You know, this seems fair. Does this seem fair to you? Yeah, that seems fair to me. Okay, let's just go do that.
Yeah.
And now that's the
It's
benefit.
about 30 seconds.
That's
Yeah.
trust.
That's trust. Yeah. But having been through multiple stories, through the multiple stages, you can understand why people would trust them. And I think coming in with a rational argument, which is it should be this amount of capital raised at this amount of valuation, with the goals, again, our goals being that we own enough of the company to make it worth our while, but at the same time not to dilute the team and so badly at the beginning. And so it's just this practice that we've had, and we've gotten to trust each other and so on.
So on the dilution front, I'm just sort of going to combine the concept of dilution and then eventually syndication for a second, because you guys have an established relationship, and so you're probably going to be somewhat protective of each other a little bit by virtue of knowing what the successes have been. But you know, when you think about, there are some founders who have just unbelievable expectations in the amount of ownership of a company that they should have. Just based on, you know, sort of what they've heard or what they talk about. So how do you get the founders to understand that you're going to protect them and that they're going to be treated fairly, and even the idea that people can be upped in subsequent rounds and things like that? And then sort of maybe if you can mix into a discussion about, you know, sort of getting the founders comfortable with the appropriate amount of ownership and protection. What happens with syndication? So if there's a relationship that exists between, say, one investor and one founder, but there is the need to syndicate a deal and bring other investors in, and not all investors necessarily have the same mindset. How do you guys approach that?
It's complex.
It's a lot of questions.
It's complex. I mean, let's go to the first one, which is the first question, which is why should people trust that we're going to treat them fairly along the way? And fair is a normative term, right? So different people have different views of what's fair. And I think what we've often done is to sort of say, well, there's a really simple phone call for you to make, call Bob Langer, and ask him how we've treated him through the years. And so in that sense, we've established a reputation for how we approach it. There's models we can demonstrate how we've done it in the past with other companies. And we sort of live to that rule, which is that's our reputation. That's how people should rely on us. They should talk to Bob, or they should talk to Tillman Gerngross, or they should talk to a bunch of other people we work with on multiple occasions. Regarding syndication, I think that's really when you bring in others to be part of the financing, you have to have that conversation with them as well, which is this is the way we approach building a company. We want to syndicate, we want the right amount of capital, and this is how we're viewing it. Now, we can't make them invest in the company. If they don't choose to pursue that path, then that's their call. But I think it's like a lot of things, and a lot of this discussion, by the way, is about relationships and trust, which is you just have that candid conversation up front, and if that's not their model, then in fact they shouldn't come into the company, and in fact you don't want them to come into the company. But there are plenty of people out there that see the way we approach the world as being an appropriate way to approach it. And there's a lot of founders that have experienced it who sort of say that's a good idea, that's a good way to go about doing it.
Bob, have you found yourself in a position where you've sort of established a paradigm and a potential syndicating investor has not seen it the same way that you and Terry are seeing it, and you've had to push back or negotiate?
I don't think I've seen that too much. I mean, I could imagine it happening, but I mean, I don't think I've seen that happen too much. I'm just trying to think if I've seen it happen at all in any of these things. But I would probably say not. But I mean, I think that, you know, again, my goals, a lot depends on what somebody wants. You know, like, I mean, to me, I've been more, I want to see, and this is, again, maybe me being an academician, but, you know, it's an interesting thing. You know, when the companies start, you raise, you know, millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. In academics, if anybody here is a professor, you know, you think if you could raise a $250,000 grant, you're doing fantastic. So I'm serious, you know. I mean, our lab is pretty well funded, but I mean, it's such a struggle. Like, I look at professors, and you know, they struggle so hard to get like one NIH grant or one grant, and sometimes people, you know, and these are people at Harvard or MIT. Sometimes it's not easy. So the fact is to me, you know, I kind of view these companies almost as a privilege to take what we do and get it out, to have the potential to get it out to the world, and it's really, and by the way, you get no equity when you are in academics. I mean, so it's a very different thing. So to me, what's been good is that the companies can take the discoveries that you make in the lab and hopefully get them out to the world. So if you get diluted a little bit more, a little bit less, I mean, you don't want to get taken advantage of, but you do want to see your work have an impact.
You know, sort of along the lines of that are how companies wind up. So some of your companies, you know, are still in their very young stages, and young in our parlance here could be 10 years, 15 years even, because it can take a long time to have an early idea translate into a therapeutic. And so with time, it requires more money, and then there's, you know, more complex ways of raising that money. Sometimes, you know, you're faced with the idea of a transaction. Do you sell the company? Should a company go public? Should a company raise more private capital? How do you guys look at the discussion about that? Not necessarily what's the right approach, but when you're getting to that approach of needing more capital, you know, what's the right way to start to approach that? How, if you were giving advice to people when you get to that sort of a pivot point, how do you start to think about those strategic alternatives?
Yeah. It's a great question, and you know, I think it also factors into how much capital is going to be required. I mean, if you're at a moment where you know you need, I'll pick a number, $300 million to run a clinical trial, you know you're going to need some sort of partnership. It's probably not going to just come from around the table of investors. It might, and again, as I was saying earlier, which is $100, $150 million first rounds these days, suggest that the financial markets are in such a way that investors are prepared to write bigger checks. But I think if there's a moment, then of course we talk about the financial sources as from venture capital and the relationship with entrepreneurs, but obviously there are other stakeholders, including large corporate partnerships, and so we have that conversation. What is the next right move? But I want to come back to actually a theme that Bob taught me day one, and I heard both Jeff and Bob Coughlin speak about earlier, which is if the goal is, I have a fiduciary responsibility to my limited partners to generate a good return, but the ultimate goal is to change people's lives. And if the right answer is, in order to achieve that goal, we need to partner this technology off to someone or even sell the company, then I would accept that as an idea. Because I think the real goal is to, and what we have found is if you aspire for this higher goal, which is to change people's lives, then the financial stuff, you typically, not always, but typically falls out of that. So we do just fine. So coming back to your question, which is, it really is a question of what's the right move for the company at the right time. If it's the right thing to enter into a large corporate partnership, that's a good idea. If we think we can add more value by doing another private round, we'll consider that. And then if need be, we'll consider the sale of the company, which can be a great outcome.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, and I agree with everything you just said. I think the only thing I'd also add to that is sometimes there are different points in history, because of the markets or because of what's going on in the world, and because of the laws, where you take different strategies. I mean, one of the boards I was on, I mentioned Alkermes before, so Rich Pops, I mean, he's been terrific. I remember I was at one meeting with him, and he mentioned to me he found 22 different ways, to raise funds for Alkermes, and that's been terrific. I mean, again, raising those funds, enables you to weather those storms, and Alkermes has been done terrific. So I think that but at different times in history, there were different rules, like limited partnerships, and obviously there's different public vehicles, different private vehicles. So I think being thoughtful about those things is really key, and having somebody who's very thoughtful financially as a CEO or CFO is also very key.
Yeah, I think that my own experience in this is also very similar to what Terry was saying. Is the money will follow if you do the right thing, and you get the therapy to the patients who need it. And I always like to say to the providers too, to put something in the hands of a physician who's had nothing is just so amazing, to give them that tool. But it does tend to follow, and we've seen these esoteric therapies like the CAR T therapies. And I say esoteric because there's a very small population that's going to benefit from those. Right. However, the value is seen because of the difference that it makes, for those patients, but also the trailblazing that it does for future therapies. So I really do think that the right premise is what's the right thing for the patients and the providers. I agree with that. You guys have been doing this for 25 plus years. And you've seen changes, and this is a question that we all get, those of us who have been in the industry a long time. But if you sort of look at the last 3 to 5 years, and you look at some of the technology changes, how data is handled, the ability to scale technology that we couldn't do before, what do you think is transformative? What do you think is going to change the way we develop companies in the future, and potentially even how we think about financing them because of what these technologies bring? Is there anything that's just like sitting there and you're thinking, wow, that is where the puck is going?
It's a great question.
Yes.
What's been striking about the 25 years, and the next 5, or the last 5 and the next 5 will be good examples of that, is the speed at which technology is changing, whether it be now the advent of big data and how does big data apply, and we've certainly had that conversation as well. For me, though, I go back to the fundamentals, which is, as I said before, by its definition, venture capital and entrepreneurship need to be on a frontier, and so we need to be able to look at that frontier. There's specific dimensions to that frontier that excite me. There's some that I'm concerned that are overstated. For example, the whole big data idea, I think in some applications can be overstated, and we're seeing a bunch of different plans for big data applications, some of which make plenty of sense, some of which seem years and years and years away. And so I think just using judgment through time and recognizing that we're going to be on this frontier and we're going to be looking for these new ideas. So again, as I said, there's a bunch, the tools that are coming out now that are really exciting to enable interrogation of biology, the transformation, we talked about CAR T, that whole area has changed so dramatically. And probably my biggest, and big data, we'll talk a lot about that, probably my biggest concern is some areas being overplayed. And again, now having been in the venture business for 30 years, you've just seen periods where people rush into a space when there are too many opportunities that are created, only to find out that only a handful of them will be successful. So I don't think I've answered your question.
No, directionally.
Yeah, no, I think you did, actually. I think you answered it very well. And actually, just as an example of what you said, and this doesn't even relate to exactly your question, but sometimes these things just seem so exciting that people just jump on a bandwagon. Like I look at it, like about 10 years ago, everybody said, well, we should start, I think a lot of VCs would say, well, we should start this energy company or that energy company. A lot of people did, and I think almost all of them did poorly. But they're just, and that may be analogous to some of the examples that you said, but it's a question of really understanding these things well enough and whether something like that does fit into a small startup company.
There's one other problem too, which there's the new ideas, and then there's the old dogma. And so when I joined the venture capital business and started life science investing 25 years ago, there was sort of, one of my mentors said there's 3 things you never do. You never do diagnostics because it's hard to make money. You never do cancer or CNS because there's problems that are too hard to crack. Well, clearly, in each case, the world is cracking that code. And so one of the issues is we're on the frontier, but we still have these sort of old dogma that sits back there, and we have to be able to clear that from our mind. And I think that's one of the bigger challenges, having been in the business for as long as I have been.
So if you think about building companies and where you build companies, and I think most of your companies have been built in the local Boston environment. I think this is especially apropos for a MassBio discussion. What is it about this environment? Because obviously you're both here, and that makes it easier to be face to face, and maybe that's the key, is that people can get in the same room together. But what do you think is enabling for company creation here, potentially versus other places?
Well, I'll say something very parochial as an academic, but I mean, to me, it's MIT and Harvard and the great hospitals. I mean, you just look at U.S. News and World Report yesterday, or they came out with the best engineering school. MIT's got the #1 in the country by a lot, and it's been that way for the last 60 every year that they've done it. Harvard, the #1 medical school by a lot, and it's the same thing every year since they've done it. And and then you look at and there's a lot of other great colleges too, and a lot of other great universities as well. And then you have Mass General and Brigham and Women's, and and so I think that, and I think Boston is such a great place. Like I say, I'm very prejudiced, but I feel like so that you have all these people come out of all these colleges and they want to stay, and you have all the getting trained here, and so many great discoveries happening here. So I really think, to me, it's never been any accident that I'd say the Boston, Cambridge area and the Palo Alto, San Francisco area, next to Stanford. I mean, I think being near great universities, to me, and hospitals, I think just has been so key to these things. I mean, there are lots bigger cities than Boston. A lot of them have better weather, and but I mean, people want to stay, and God bless them, and just look what's happened in the last 40 years.
Well, Terry, you're from Buffalo, so you're not a weather wimp. We know that.
We're both from Buffalo.
Yeah,
so.
right. So.
The only thing I would add to Bob's comment, and again, I want to throw flowers in MassBio's path as well, and Bob has done such a fantastic job, which is we've created a cluster, and it's by the way, it's a concentrated cluster. The distance isn't that far. We've created a cluster, which has in turn created success, and success begets success. And so this virtuous cycle which in turn has attracted people to come to Boston, I think is remarkable. That's why I have every confidence that in 15, 20, 30 years we'll be as prominent in this space as we've ever been.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Any questions? I have one more question for you guys, but yes, over here.
Just going back to what you were saying about jumping on the bandwagon, something we're keenly watching as a startup data analytics company is this whole thing around AI and machine learning. Everybody's doing it, so it's the hype word. But if you're not advertising yourself as being in that bucket, you're also being discounted. Can you comment on that to give us some guidance?
Sure. I want to come back to the buzzword concept. I mean, you're right. I can see where people attach that, but I think it really goes back to the fundamentally, what are you doing? And so the strong investors will essentially try to pierce through that and try to better understand that. So my concern is that everything comes in with an AI dimension to it, that in fact, it's almost there because somehow people think you're going to be able to raise a bigger check because you put artificial intelligence involved. And in fact, if there's none underneath it, then it doesn't make any sense at all. And so I think it just goes to, you have to be true to what you're doing, and if what you're doing is going to transform the world, then you're going to be able to find capital whether it has AI involved or not. But the concern is, again, that we'll see 10 AI-based drug development companies in a couple of weeks, and can there really be that many unique ideas that can get launched at once? I don't know if I've answered your question, but.
Other questions from the audience? Okay.
I just wanted to ask about,
Just going back to your comment about the cluster around Boston and Cambridge, I've heard reports that there are other medical centers and other universities outside of this area. I haven't seen them personally, but I think they do exist. But in all seriousness, you know, it seems like there's a little bit of a disconnect if you look even as far as UMass Med School in Worcester and then go even further west to UMass main campus in Amherst, for example, just keeping it Massachusetts-centric. Like what are your thoughts about how to take what probably is good science that could nucleate companies that come out of these places that aren't located in the sort of human capital cluster or medical cluster of a place like Boston or Cambridge?
So clearly there's great science in other universities than those that are found in Cambridge and Boston, and some that are absolutely worthy of creating companies around. I just think what's striking about the cluster itself is that you have this concentration of all the players that are required, whether it be capital itself, talent, corporate involvement, et cetera. And by the way, when we started Polaris as a venture capital firm, we were in Waltham. And even today, Waltham seems like a world away. We're in Seaport because we had to come into the city because people didn't even want to go as far as Waltham to talk about getting their companies financed. And so the clusters are these amazing things. They need to be supported. The MassBio has done an enormously job in supporting those companies than the cluster itself. But the fact of the matter is, if I had a good idea and I was at Amherst, I would come to Boston. I would come to Boston and try to get my company funded, and you may end up establishing the company. Now, there are smaller, highly effective locations, and I'm a little biased. I'm also a Dartmouth guy, and so there's some stuff going up in Hanover, particularly around Tilman Gerngross and his work, which has been remarkable, and he's been able to maintain his presence up there. So there's other places, and I was involved with Decode, which was out of Reykjavik, Iceland. So you can develop great science in other locations, but you can't ignore the fact that this cluster is so powerful that it sort of there's a magnetic force to it that just brings you here.
Do you think there are other things that groups like MassBio could do to kind of smooth that path?
I think that they're already doing that, to be honest with you. We have innovation services within the context of what MassBio does, brings founders together with mentors in our society, or in our industry here, and then also brings them together with interesting opportunities for early funding. So I think that they are already doing that, and not all the companies that get involved in that are directly from the Boston area. So I think MassBio is already doing something to support early financing and innovation. So maybe I would just ask you one quick closing question from each of you, and I'll offer my own perspective as well. So if you were going to give advice to young entrepreneurs, people who are coming in and maybe they want to go into venture, maybe they want to be, founding entrepreneurs, maybe they want to do both, but if you had to just impart one piece of advice to people, what would that be? I'll start and basically say that, going back to a question, a fear of failure is going to kill you, right? If you lead with the concept of, oh my God, what if it fails? You'll never try. So it's kind of like a word that doesn't even necessarily exist in our lexicon. And you have to really embrace that and feel really good about that. And you just keep going at it. So that would be what I would say.
Yeah, well, mine isn't too different than yours. I end up giving a number of commencement speeches at colleges, and I think the kind of thing I would say to almost anybody, regardless of their area and what they want to do when they're a young person, I always say to dream big dreams, dreams that can change the world, but recognize that you're going to hit a lot of failures, you'll get a lot of criticism if you try to think like that, and just don't give up.
Yeah.
And for me, and I'll take a view maybe a little more from the venture capital perspective, which is I just recognize that early in my career, I benefited enormously by the people that I was able to associate with. And so, we would sometimes talk about how do you essentially go out and collect people. And for me, that's the other thing, which is get into a network of people that are incredibly accomplished, talented, critical, will push back on your ideas. And when we've had some young teams come and present that have done an amazing job of collecting talent that you would never have thought, people that want to lend their brand and lend their ideas and to aid them. And so this people collecting ideas is something that's really been important for us.
Yeah, no, that's
Very
great.
good point.
Well, thanks everyone very much. Really appreciate everybody's attention. And Bob and Terry, thanks very much.
Thank you, Albie. That was great.